Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriaut, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Welcome, everyone, to The Curious Collector and what is going to be a very special multi-part series discussing the life, the times, the career, the adventures, the stories of doll legend Florence Theriault. Now, let me start by saying that this is special for me as well, because I think most people know it, but some new listeners might not be aware. But Florence is actually my mother. And so she is the founder of Theriaut, the firm that for 55 years now has been involved in the doll world and the auction industry in some form or another. And now, over the past 30, 40 years, really been a global leader in the sale of some of the most famous and iconic collections around the world. But you know, it's so interesting. I realized that my mom, who I talk to every day and know personally, obviously, my whole life, I've realized that she is a very private person. And a lot of people really have not, especially new generation of collectors who mostly engage online or tend to not be as extroverted in coming to auctions in person and meeting Florence and talking with her, may not really know who is this woman behind the woman. And it's kind of a funny story, but a couple of years ago, I was sitting in a home somewhere and I was talking to this woman and we talked about Florence. She said, "Oh, Florence, she's like the Betty Crocker of the doll world." And I was like, stop for a minute. I was like, Betty Crocker? And I'm like, but Betty Crocker is not a real person. And I realized, but that's how people tend to think of Florence in some cases who have never really met her or gotten to know her and listened to some of her incredible stories over the years, not only in the doll world, not only in the auction world, but as a woman entrepreneur coming into this in 1970 and the trials and tribulations of that in itself, which I think is the story of many women entrepreneurs through history, which parallel a lot of the doll world. So this is a really incredible opportunity today for everyone to learn about Florence the woman. You know, she tells everybody else's stories through her whole life. Her work has been telling the stories of the doll makers, telling stories of the sculptors, of the artists, and then mostly telling stories of the collectors and the people behind the collections we've sold, so that people have a certain level of identity and understanding to the collectors out there who are now engaging, so that their story continues on. Because as I always say, collecting is an extension of oneself. But in doing so, Florence has rarely, if ever, told her story. So this is where we are today, an opportunity, a chance over multi-parts to hear a bit more about Florence's life, her legacy, what she did to evolve in this field, and understand the woman behind Theriaut and the catalogs, and our founder, in my opinion, the matriarch of the doll world today, to hear in her own words everything that she's experienced firsthand. So welcome, Florence, or should I say Mom, welcome to The Curious Collector, and I'm really excited and looking forward to this conversation and sharing with others your stories. How are you?
Well, I'm pretty good, except after listening to all of this talk about doyen and matriarch and all that, you're making me feel old. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute, I am. But there it is.
Don't. You are the youngest 83-year-old I know out there. So you're doing great. And I know how hard you work. So kudos to you.
Stuart, I have to tell you that if I'm young, it's because I have been very fortunate that every day of my life I wake up and sometimes I just like to curl back up and sleep a little more. But then I think, oh, wait, I've got to do this today. I've got to catalog this. I've got to work on this collection. Oh, I promised so-and-so I would call them and talk about some things. And there's so much purpose in my life that if there's anything that keeps me young, I talk to people about this constantly. We all need purpose so much. And I'm just grateful that I have that purpose.
It's funny you mentioned
More
that
grateful in the morning than I am in the evening, by the way, when I'm tired.
Well, I can imagine. Because I know how hard you work, 7 days a week, sometimes 9, 10, 11 hours a day. And it's truly an inspiration. And, I often tell in my doll lectures and talks that collecting keeps you young. That is, I say collecting, but the reality really being anything related to a passion whatsoever is the thing that keeps you young, Florence. And so, kudos to you, as I said before. And please, for all of our benefits, the world of dolls, keep going, woman.
Well, I don't have any choice because you keep bringing in collections and saying, "Oh, I've got to get this catalog out by next week." So, Stuart, thank you. I think
Okay. Right.
Not always, but most of the time.
All right. So listen, one of the things I think a lot of people are not familiar with is where you came from, your life before. I have said earlier that you tell the stories of the lives of collectors from their childhood on every week, and yet no one has really ever told yours. So I'm going to give you an opportunity here to relate some of your early years growing up, the family you came from, where you were raised, how all of this, and hopefully piecing together where it all led into the curiosity and to the work that would become your life's work. So kind of take us back in time a little bit, where it all started.
You kept using this phrase. In fact, when we were talking about this yesterday, you used it. And you said, I'm a very private person. And I don't think that about myself at all. I don't think I'm not private or that I am private. It never occurs to me. But since you've said that, I've been thinking about it a lot. And I kind of think I go back to where I was brought up. I'm a New Englander by background. Both of my families are New Englanders and had been for generations. And I think that's probably that reticence that so many New Englanders have. I think that probably is what is in me, ingrained in me, so that your business is your business and you don't inflict it on other people and tell them your life story and everything. You just go about doing what you have to do. I grew up in a family, the really happy family. My mother and father never had much money, but early on they put enough money together to buy a farm in Connecticut. And although they both worked all their lives, they had the farm. And my father, I'm happy to say, was one of the first people in the 1950s who believed in organic farming and was a very strong advocate of it. And we used to have our little fruit stand out in front of our house, only he didn't charge for anything. He just told neighbors to take what they wanted and eat. And very, very careful eater himself, what he thought was proper foods to have in your body. So I grew up in that atmosphere with 3 sisters. Okay, I'm going to confess, I never collected dolls. I never played with dolls. I was more of a reader, and I also never played sports. In fact, when we had baseball teams in the neighborhood, I was always the last one anyone ever wanted on their team. But, I'm kind of trying to paint a picture of you of what life was like in the late 1940s and into the 1950s until I graduated from high school in 59 and went to a teacher's college for a year and then went on to Springfield College for 2 more years and then dropped out of school until I went back 10 years later, where I got my degree and went on to study library science, because during that 10 years, I had been working in a library and I loved the atmosphere. I had loved reading all my life. And at that point, libraries were still more about books than they were about technology. Technology didn't really exist. We're talking the 1960s. Stuart may remember some of those years because I used to drag him along with me to the library when I had to work some days. And he spent some of his childhood reading children's books in the library. It is true.
Oh, Florence, I'm so horrified. This is not supposed to be relating stories of me as a child, but I guess go ahead. But it's true, yes, I did spend really my younger years growing up in libraries every single day while you were working. I would come back from school and go to the libraries, and you taught me how to research and read and find books in the library. Good memories.
Well, there was one time, actually, you escaped from the library, and when it was time for me to leave, I couldn't find you anywhere. And I got the help of everyone in the library, and we searched all over, and we finally found you outside the library under a tree where you had gone to take a nap and you were sleeping. That's a very cherished memory I have of you, Stuart.
Okay, all right. Okay, can we stop sharing memories of me as a child?
Fine. No problem.
Okay. But tell me about this period and how it all grew into where you are today. So you were in the library, you were working in the library, and then you went to Kentucky, to the University of Kentucky, where you got a degree in library science, I believe, correct?
Exactly, yes. And so I came back to Connecticut at that point. I was directing a small public library, which was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I really liked that. But at that point, we moved to Pennsylvania, you and I did, and we went to Pennsylvania and we started going around to auctions. My husband, George Theriault, and I started going to auctions on the weekends. And we became like many collectors that all of a sudden you're going to auctions and you're loving the auctions and you're having a wonderful time. And then one day you walk in your house and you said, there is no place for us to sit. There is stuff everywhere. What are we going to do? So my husband at that point said, well, I can auction just as well as these other people can auction. So we're going to start our own company and we're going to auction ourselves. So we looked around and we found this in a small town just north of where we were in Scranton. I'm sure you remember it well, Stuart.
I do.
This old country farmhouse, which had next to it a bus garage, an old abandoned bus garage. And we thought, well, that's the perfect place for us. And we really had no money, quite honestly. But we went up there and we met the man who owned it. And he was an old farmer. And he came and met us in his oshkosh bagosh overalls. And he met us and he just looked as though he was kind of like a country hayseed. Well, this guy was, let me tell you, he was pretty savvy business-wise. And he said, well, I tell you what, you don't have any money, so I'm going to let you buy it from me and you can just pay me every month. And so we signed a contract and found out years later that what we had signed a contract for was this old-fashioned way they had of selling property, which now has become outlawed, that he could retrieve it back at any time that we missed one payment. The entire thing would revert back to him. It was kind of done quite a bit. And nevertheless, it was the only option we had. We bought this old bus garage and we started every Friday night. We would sell whatever we could buy that week. We sold it. We started advertising in the local papers. Just to Stuart, to your mortification, we bought 2 old used Volkswagen double cabs. We painted them bright yellow and painted a clown face on the front and with big signs, we buy anything old. And you had that horrifying experience of that being your parents' car when you went to school.
Oh, the worst was being picked up at school and everybody pointing as these VW trucks came up, all painted bright yellow. But the clown faces were really the big thing. But boy, they became noticed. And I would say that was your first real foray into marketing, almost guerrilla style marketing that kind of shaped your future because it worked.
Well, we learned then, we put ads in. That's when people still put ads in newspapers. It still existed. And we put ads in that we would buy. And at this point, not just dolls, any kind of antiques. And people would call us from their home and they would say, yes, I have some things to sell. And my husband and I would go out every day. We learned we would go into people's homes. We would see what they had. We would make them an offer. They would take the offer or not take the offer. But we learned to really be fair with people, to tell them, this is what we think it will probably sell for. Here's what we're willing to pay you for it. And we built a business that way. And then every Friday night, no matter what we had bought, we took it up and we auctioned it. And Stuart, you ran I don't think we had coffee even. We had soda and candy
concession, yes.
Until the time that we found after the auction that there were more candy bar wrappers under the counter that someone had used during the day.
Great.
You know
another story and another one about me as a kid. Thanks a lot. The hits keep coming.
They just keep coming.
I fully admit I ate more candy than I actually sold.
Yes, you did. One time at an auction, Stuart got so excited he ran in the house because what is it? You had a bow and arrow set or something like that?
Yes.
And you decided, oh, this is good money. I'm going to sell this. And you brought it out and sold it. And it brought a terrible price.
$1, actually.
$1. And you started to cry. And the man who bought it felt so bad. He said, well, here, just you can have it. It's okay. And George would not let you have it. He said, no, you made a decision. Now you live with your decision. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. And it still haunts me today. But I always cite this moment as being my first opportunity to feel empathy towards a consignor and the emotions of selling an object. So it's lived with me and served me well over the years. This
fine. That's what it should have done, that your decisions count.
Florence, it was the Wild West in Pennsylvania during that time in the antique world. I mean, this was, imagine 1970, 71, 72, Pennsylvania. It was ground central of the antiques industry across the United States. Some of the biggest shows, flea markets, auction houses were everywhere. And you were in the midst of this at that time.
It was a wonderful time. It was so much fun, and there was a lot of things available, and we just had a great time. Well, what we started to realize, though, was that if you could isolate things topically, that you could have a better market for them, because sure, you'd have your regulars every week, but people that collected a certain type of thing would be more apt to come if they had more of a selection available to them. So, for example, we would save things that we had brought in, and once every 6 months, we would have an early American auction. We would have quilts and early American furniture, and you could still get a lot of good pieces in that at the time. And we had dolls and toys. And this went on for several years, and we loved the dolls and toys. Now, I do want to admit to you, I said the words before about the bus garage. Well, when we first started our auctions in the bus garage, to be honest, it was a dirt floor. Okay. Then we very quickly concreted the floor, and we fixed it up, and it looked kind of nice inside. And there was one problem, however, and it only became really obvious to us when we had our doll auctions. You remember it well, Stuart.
I do.
We had these wonderful women come up, and I remember one woman in particular. She was so elegantly dressed all the time. She had this beautiful fur coat, and her hair was done just so. And then they would come in, and they would look at the dolls, and then they would say, well, I need to use the restroom. Where would that be? And I said, well, you go out the front door, and you just turn around the side of the building, and there's a job Johnny over there. And that was the bathroom that we had to offer people. So we decided, okay, if we're going to continue with these doll auctions, we've got to go to hotels. And at that point, we made the decision that we were going to specialize in dolls. And that was in the mid-1970s. And we never turned back. We stopped with all other type of antiques, and we went into dolls and childhood playthings and toys, as the toys that related to dolls. And that became our forte, and decided we would travel to a hotel. We would bring our items to a hotel where they would have bathrooms.
Have actual plumbing. Yes,
actual plumbing.
It's so funny to go back in time to the inspiration when you look at, like, I mean, not to compare us to like Apple or Microsoft, but, you know, their humble beginnings in a garage. You know, every company starts somewhere, and ours was in a garage as well, and didn't even have plumbing. And it's so interesting that that became the catalyst or the inspiration of how you needed to go to another level, how you needed to take it to another level. Before we go into that, though, because Pennsylvania was full of characters at that time in the antique world. I mean, there were some really interesting, unique personalities. You didn't study the antique business. Nobody did. You just kind of fell into it, and you learned along the way. Are there any stories you remember in those early days of characters you met, or funny moments that happened to you, lessons learned?
I think in asking that, Stuart, you touched on what I have always loved most about our business, and that's the people that inhabit it. Even more than the subject itself, which I know we'll get into as we go along. The people that are collectors and or dealers, they cross every kind of economic spectrum there is, from the extreme wealthy to people that would take the last meal out of their house in order to buy something that is their passion. And those kind of personalities have always been most intriguing to me. I love that part of them. I remember I always talk about it at times because it says a lot to me about how people acquire things. There one time after an auction, one of the people, we're still in Pennsylvania, that had sat there all day, and she came up after the auction, and she said, well, you didn't get to sell the things that are over there on that side of the room. And I said, I know, but they'll be here next week. And she said, well, would you sell that one to me now? And I said, no, we only sell the things at auction. That's our principle. That's what we follow. She said, oh, but if you sell it at auction, I can't afford it. And I always remember that, because to me, and I've used this many, many times with people who are debating what would be the best way to sell something. And sometimes they'll say, well, won't you just buy it from us? Then you can sell it. I'd say, if that would be something that you absolutely want to do, we're not going to pass up being able to handle the merchandise, but that's not your best way. Not at all. Let us market it and auction it for you, and we'll get you the best price. I sound like I'm trying to market something now when I'm saying that. I'm not. I'm just telling you kind of a philosophy that I have always lived on. I remember there was a rare book dealer who was in Scranton, and he was quite the fellow. If you saw him walking down the street, you wouldn't think he had 2 cents to his name. And for all I know, he didn't have 2 cents to his name, but he had a brain and he had a curiosity and he had a brilliant mind. I loved meeting people like that. That's always been really the best part of our business.
Oh, indeed, Florence. Even growing up back then as a kid, remembering the characters in Pennsylvania and New York State and all those areas in the Northeast in the antique business. Are there any other memories that you recall of some of these different people and maybe lessons they gave you as you were coming up as a young lady entrepreneur in the antique world?
Well, I just remember a lot of antique dealers, and everyone had different approaches. Like some of the lessons I've learned was the move your mistakes message. People that would always say, we would sell things at our Friday night auctions, and if we had paid $100 for it and we ended up selling it $60, well, that's on us. We paid too much for it, or we didn't market it correctly or whatever. But we just moved ahead with selling it because we had learned very early that what you need to do is move your mistakes. If you bought it, you sold it, there it goes. It's gone. You're going to move on and do something else. I also learned from another antique dealer who was really, really knowledgeable in, I believe it was Rookwood pottery. And I said, how did you get so much knowledge in this one subject? And he said, well, I decided when I became an antique dealer that I had an interest in many, many things. But what I learned to do was that for 2 years, I would delve deeply into a particular subject. And it could be a very small niche, like in his case, Rookwood pottery. And you become very knowledgeable in that. And then if you want to move on to another, you can. But you own that then. You own that knowledge. You own that piece of information. And that bodes you very, very well. I learned from another person who lived in our hometown who was a doll dealer. And I always remember she gave us some dolls to sell one time. And as we were packing them up and taking them, she said, oh, wait, that doll that you just packed, would you get that back out again? I need that bonnet that doll is wearing. And I said, well, why? It's on the doll. And she said, no, you don't know. That bonnet, it looks so good on every doll. I sold more dolls because it was wearing that bonnet than anything else. It helped me learn about presentation and how things could affect the sale of an item. And that was information. You could not go to a university and get the education that I got from the first 10 years of our business, from hard knocks, from face on with customers, from learning how auctions work, learning how customers work, learning to buy in people's homes, all of the kind of issues you could come up with. It was worth $1 million. And that hands-on experience was absolutely extraordinary.
Oh, I can certainly imagine. But there's got to be one thing, though, one mistake. I mean, the mistakes are ultimately the education. That's how you learn. But there's got to be one that, if there's one mistake you made back then that you say,
one?
Wow, okay, well, pick one that you could go back in time and do it over again. What would it be? Is there one that really stands out to you?
I would say it was the book business. You know, I told you that my background was as a librarian, and I have always loved books. And we were going into people's homes, and one of the things many homes had to sell were shelves and shelves of books. And so doesn't that seem like a natural? We would start an adjunct book auction business. Well, one thing I learned very quickly, books are heavy. And when you're going to, well, it's true, Stuart. They are really heavy. And you can carry boxes and boxes and boxes of books, and none of them are going to sell for more than $1. It was a very specialized niche, just like the gentleman who had told me that he would focus on one thing and learn that in a year. It didn't take me long to learn. This is not just one thing. This is a whole world in itself, the subject of antique and vintage and collectible books. And so we very quickly learned to advertise for a person to come in and take over that part of the business with us. And he did book auctions for us for several years until we moved to Maryland, as a matter of fact, and still continued the business after that. And for him, for a one-person business, it worked very well. But for us, that book business, that was a bad mistake.
It was a heavy load.
It was thank you. Good pun, Stuart.
Okay.
It was a very heavy
Right.
load to carry. And the worst part of it was, if there was ever a subject in which I probably would have kept half of the things that I brought in to sell, that would be one of them. So.
Yeah, that's funny. I want to relate one story if I can, because it's always stuck with me over the years that you and George told me about going into people's homes. And you talked to me about how one time you went into this home in Scranton and this woman had I believe like a china cabinet, and she was going to sell it. And George said, well, ma'am, I can give you $30 for it. And she had this look on her face and she looked in shock, and she said, $30? And you and George looked at each other and you said to her, okay, we can give you $40. And she went in again, looking in a state of shock, $40? And then you and George looked at each other and then finally said, okay, ma'am, that's it. We can give you $50, but we cannot do anything else. There's just no money to be made on it after that. The $50 is our final offer. And she looked at you both and said, $50? I was shocked you were going to give me $30.
Stuart, that is a true story. And it wasn't a china closet. It was a lamp. And I will tell you, that lamp sits on a table in my house to this day because I could never bear to sell it. That's at the time when we bought the items. And which is why I will tell you, when we moved out of general antiques and moved into dolls, what is the one rule that we made? And we stick by it to this day. What is it, Stuart?
Well, there's a number of rules. I have a whole book of them you gave me. But
well,
one is you offer the best price from the beginning.
No, the one is you do not work for us and collect dolls. We do not collect dolls. Right. No one who comes to work for us full time is allowed to have a doll collection because we do not want to compete with the people that are coming to our auctions to buy from us. And I think that has served us in very, very good stead. I don't mean to be sounding self-righteous about it, but it's a conflict. At that point, we were buying from people, so that was neither here nor there. But at the point that we converted over to selling on consignment for people, we determined that you work for that person, but you also have to give a fair deal and a fair offer to your people who come to buy from you. So you can't mesh the two. You've got to just get every product you have out there to the public and not be part of the picture.
And remember that the first offer you give someone, when they show a face of shock, it may be that they can't believe you've offered that much. So
yes.
And that's something I've always remembered, with the lesson being then, if somebody looks like they're shocked, I always say, what, is it too much? And so anyway, but yeah, those were great times, I can imagine. And, I have memories, of course, growing up in it, but not really working daily other than in the concession candy shop. And then I remember the moment, the transition. It happened in the mid-'70s when you left behind a really viable regional auction house that was growing and doing well. And you made the courageous decision that you were going to completely specialize in dolls. And take us back in this moment and what happened. And let me guess, you've never told me this, but I'm going to guess that you had to turn down some collections in the process. One
of the best collections that ever was offered to us came about 3 months after we made the determination to only move into dolls. It was a beautiful estate in Scranton, and we turned it down, but we made a path, and that was the path we were going to take. Once we started to do that, I told you we went to a hotel to have our first doll auction because they had bathrooms. And that was in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. And I still run into people these days that would say, oh, yes, I came to your auction when you had them in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. In fact, I know some people that came to our first auctions in Pennsylvania back in our old bus garage. And for example, we are selling in June, we're selling the final estate collection of Nikki Kavitka. And she was one of the people who would come up to our Bull Barn doll auctions in Pennsylvania. So there's such a long trail of history with people, both in their buying and selling days, that it's just an important part of my life and my whole memory bank in this field that it's carried on through.
But you came into the dolls with this commitment. And what was it like?
Well, after we were in Stroudsburg, we decided, well, you know what? You packed everything up. You've loaded it in your van or your truck to move it to the hotel. Well, what's the difference between going to Stroudsburg and then going, say, I don't know, you'll correct me on the mileage, Stuart, another 1,000 miles and go to Florida. So we decided to take an auction, and we went down and we had our auction. Our first auction in Florida was in Orlando, and it was great. And then other times we would go over to West Palm Beach in Florida, and many of those customers became lifelong customers with us. And then we learned, well, okay, if you can go to Florida, then where else could you go? And we would go to Chicago, we would go to Texas, and my love of my life, California. And I always think I probably was born in the wrong place. Maybe I'm not a New Englander. I might have been a Californian. Although I kind of think that the California I fell in love with was California of the 1940s. And never moved there, but always we thought of moving there because we just fell in love with Southern California. It was just an incredible place.
I remember those early first auctions you ever did in California. We're now, for those who are kind of following the chronology of this life, we've now kind of entered into the late 70s and going into the early 80s. And this was the really big turning point of where it was originally Fleetville Auctions becoming Theriault's and starting to appear all over the country. And I remember these early days in California. And some of those early California collectors, they were the richest characters in the world of dolls by far. And I know they had a huge impact on you, some of these different
they
collectors.
Absolutely did. Do you know, this fascinates me. When we first started going out to California, and I would talk to collectors there, and it occurred to me after I talked to about 15 or 20 or 25 or 50 of them, none of them were native Californians. They had all moved there from somewhere else in America. I mean, that's not true anymore. Now people are native Californians. Oh, sure, people still move there, but not like then. Then California was still a state of settlement. People were going there. And when they went there, they were different than any other people I knew in this country. They were adventuresome. They were willing to take gambles. If they did something and it burst up in their face, well, dig in and try it again. And I had so much admiration for that. It was just absolutely wonderful. And I met so many great collectors that I have such memories of. One of the first really good collections we have. Well, understand, we had gone, and I know you will remember this well, Stuart, our family took a vacation and we went to Guatemala. And this would be
1976.
1976. And we went to Guatemala on a vacation. And the first night we were in Guatemala, I woke up in the middle of the night and I said to my husband, George, someone is shaking our bed. And he said, it's not that, it's an earthquake. And that was that famous Guatemalan earthquake where so many people were killed. It took us a week to get out of there. And to leave the country, there was no airport anymore. It was a horrible time. And I think all of us were really deeply affected by it. Consequently, I made the vow I would never go to California because somehow I had in my mind that an earthquake in California, well, it wouldn't cross the state line. So I would go to Oregon, but I wouldn't go to California. I know. However, curiosity and the search for antiques finally won out, and went to California once to look at a collection. And that's when I fell in love with the state. One of the first collections we ever got from California, and I absolutely love this woman. She was 95 years old. Her name was Vi Bennett. She lived in Oakland, California. She had been one of the people, because she would tell us her life story, who had come to California as a young woman with no money, with nothing. But she talked her way into being this fashion expert at a local Furrier's and worked her way up in the store, and where she met a man who had a lot of money, and they got married, and she lived a really interesting, fascinating life. And she had a fabulous doll collection. And that was one of the really best first collections we ever got. Vi Bennett was her name. And there were so many others that were like that. Dee Devine from Southern California was just a wonderful woman that I absolutely loved. She told me stories about how she would go to Paris early on days. I talk about this a lot. People don't realize how hard it was to do research years ago. And I'm not talking about in the 1800s. I'm talking about 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. This little thing called the internet did not exist. You had to find a book, and you couldn't find the book you needed for the obscure pieces of information that a doll would afford you. That didn't happen that easily. And I remember Dee telling me how she had gone to Paris and how she had walked all over Paris, and she'd finally gotten into the Paris archives. And then she had found a way that she could pay page by page to get a photocopy of old documents and old registrations. And she shared all of these with me. She was a wonderful person. Dee was one of the first women pilots in World War II.
See, California is just filled, and these collectors. And some of the earliest clubs for UFDC were coming out of California in the 1950s, the 101 Doll Club. Yeah, I know that California had a major impact on you, and it soon became one of our premier markets for doing auctions, that you were conducting some of your biggest sales in California and Southern California primarily, and in Northern California.
Well, you can just hear from the way I talk about it, how I fell in love with that state and fell in love with the personalities. I mean, everyone talks about California for the climate and all, and absolutely, believe me, this winter we've just been through, I would have been happy to have had some of the climate, although not the fires. But it was the people. The people were they were different. And I just fell in love with it, which is why we continue to take our auction there as frequently as we did, because it was a very exciting time and people were adventuresome. And
was really probably the largest center of collecting in the U.S. was in California, shockingly.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And some of the earliest collections you can trace into California. If you remember Lucy Earle, I mean, going back to the 1920s, collecting. These were people collecting their own nostalgic childhood, but that happened to be Brews and Jameau's. And so they were all in California. And people would never think of it because they think California new. But no, it was a pioneer place.
Well, Stuart, it was a pioneer place because it was the first Barbie auction we ever held was in California. And that was, I believe, in 1982. And it was really intriguing because this was another one of the California collections. We had been called to the home of Jane Jones, and she wanted to sell her antique collection. And we said, why? This is a very nice collection. Why do you want to sell it? And she said, oh, it's my husband. I'm just tired of him making fun of me all the time and mocking me to his friends. He thinks that this is just child play and I shouldn't be doing this. So we said, fine, we sold it. Well, I'm going to tell you what happened. That collection made her such a big profit that guess what happened? Who became the biggest collector in the family after that?
The husband. Probably.
The
yes,
husband.
Exactly.
He said, oh, I have missed the bet, because it was about that time the stock market did one of its major crashes, and he lost so much money in his stocks, and she had just made so much money on her dolls. He was pretty thrilled, and he encouraged her to go back into collecting. And she amassed a really fine Barbie collection, which we later sold for her also. And it was the first ever all Barbie auction. We held that in California. And I always remember the woman at the back of the room at the auction. We must have been selling a piece of Barbie underwear or something. And she was bidding on it. And all of a sudden she stood up and said, well, that's it. I'm not paying more for Barbie's girdle than I'd pay for my own. It was so much fun. And there were just, different things that went on, just good memories.
If you go to my Facebook page and scroll down a few months ago, a video surfaced from Bradley Justice, actually, I believe, who found it, of a news program of that auction. And it's amazing. I was, I think, 18 at the time. It was one of the very first auctions I've ever done. And I was up there in the podium and I had like a Tom Selleck mustache and permed hair. And it's quite the retro look of the auctions, and probably the only documentation we've ever found of any of those early auctions back there in the early 80s period, which was such a turning point for you, for Theriault, for the whole company. And I think it's kind of where we'll end this part one this week until we talk next week in part two about the real rise of Theriault and the change in you, a transformational moment, if you will, in what Theriault would end up becoming over the next decade or two. And we'll come back next week and share that and hear some more stories on that time as well, Florence, Mom. And thanks for this week, and we'll talk more next.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriault.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.